Hello and welcome to Maine Law Matters.
It is my honor today to be interviewing Professor Martin Rogoff. Marty, if you don't mind, I'm going to refer to you as Marty and you're going to refer to me as Lee. We're going to be as casual as possible today, and we're going to start with, where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in New York City, but I moved to New Rochelle, New York when I was 1 year old and lived there until basically I went to college.
So high school was public or private?
Public high school, New Rochelle High School, which was one of the really best high schools in the country at that time. New Rochelle was an upscale suburb of New York, and a lot of the teachers there, were like graduate students at Columbia University and, going for PhDs or stuff like that. And it was just really, really an excellent school. And my schoolmates there were just brilliant people. I mean, there were like a dozen or more went to top Ivy League schools or Williams or places like that. And it was just really a very good place to go to high school in terms of academics.
So you enjoyed high school?
Yes, I did. I mean, I worked hard to do well, and there was a lot of competition academically there. And
were you involved in any sports? We have spoken with one of your students who played football all through high school. Were you a football player?
Not really. I basically ran cross country, and then in the fall, and then we had winter track, and then we had spring track, and I did like the half mile, and I would say sort of a mid-level, sort of mediocre plus athlete, but I enjoyed it, and I liked being on the team, and it was basically track running that I did. That's
great. So you went from high school off to, am I remembering this correctly, Cornell?
Yes.
And why Cornell?
Well, I guess the main reason was an uncle of mine was a professor there. He was just hired. He was a young guy, and I had some other options, but I decided to go there. And my experience there was kind of mixed. I really didn't like the school. I didn't like its isolation or a lot of things about it. But I thought academically it was really, really first rate. And it was a very rigorous school. I went to a top high school with top colleagues, top teachers, and yet when I got to Cornell, I just felt really unprepared. And I just had to really work hard. And the grading there was very, very rigorous. Like if you had an 80 average, they did numerical averages for your grades. So if you had an 80 average, which would now be like a B minus or a low B, you were in the top 12% of the class. Wow. And the average grade was like 2.5, it was like a C plus. And I really had to work really, really, really hard to do well.
What did you study at Cornell?
Well, I studied history. That was my thing. And in fact, I thought I was going to go to graduate school in history, which I did. Ultimately, I went to Berkeley, University of California, wanting to get a PhD in history and basically be a history professor. And then I guess I also suffered or benefited from the Jewish mother syndrome. And she said, why don't you apply to law school? So I applied to a couple of law schools, and I got into the law schools, the first one, and then I got into the second, which I preferred. So I said the first one I wasn't going, and the second one I wasn't going. So I ended up going to the third one, but I had drafted a letter to them saying I wasn't going to come and I was going to stay in history. And then, I don't know, I just, for one reason or another, just decided I would go to law school. And,
so your third choice was Yale?
Well, I first got into, I guess Stanford, and then I got into Harvard, and then Yale was I was accepted to them third, and so. And I had a cousin that I really, really admired who went to Yale Law School. And it also had the reputation of being more sort of academic, more progressive. I'm not sure that's really true, but that's what its reputation was. It ended up being, in a sense, the best thing I ever did, because the way I look at law, and I'm sort of some of my colleagues at the law school are very practice oriented or have practice backgrounds or relate to the bar and bench a lot more, and I'm more on the academic side of the thing. I like legal history, jurisprudence, and all that stuff. Yale was, I think, a very good
It was a good fit for you.
A good fit for me. And I'm always thankful to my mother because I think law was just the ideal thing for me because, history is very academic. You write articles or books and about things in the past. And I think that's very useful and helpful and everything. But law, as I like to say, is kind of like history or political science applied. It's like applied political science because it's not only that you know the stuff and think about the stuff, but you actually develop strategies to implement the stuff.
So let me ask you, while we're talking about history, there are a lot of changes in the United States right now about how we review and talk about our own history. Is that something that has happened throughout the decades?
Well, I don't think it's been as prominent as it has been for the last, say, 30 years, where there's a lot of emphasis on people who have been excluded from history before, like women or minorities or just average persons or poor people. And it was more the history of kings and governments and wars and stuff like that. And I think history is always written with an eye on the present, really. I mean, you're writing about or studying history and thinking about history for what light it sheds on the present or advocacy points it can give you for
how it connects with what we are doing right now.
Yeah, but it's kind of instrumental. It's used for something. It's not just simply why you study this instead of that or write about this instead of that. I think it has a lot to do with your sort of your views, your social, political, cultural, economic views.
So you graduated from Yale, and what was the next step?
Well, the professor I worked for, who was not worked for, but I took courses from, and we had to do a major third-year paper, as a graduation. We used to have that at the law school here. Probably, I think, when you were there, that's gone by the board, so it's sort of been changed. But I did I wrote a 100 or 125-page paper on some aspect of international law history, and focusing on Hugo Grotius and the who's kind of considered the father of international law, and some predecessors. My professor, who was really the foremost international law professor in the country at that time, he was very famous. His name was Myers McDougall. Asked me to stay on after graduation and work for him, and I was what they called a research associate at the law school for about a year or maybe a year and a half, working for him, doing research. And a colleague of his, a guy named Harold Lasswell, who was very, very famous in the political science world. McDougall and Lasswell did a lot of work together, and so I worked with both of them, and this went on for, like a year and a half. But McDougall had a very rigorous method of analysis and a theory, and it was international law at that time, at least his version of it, was called the New Haven School. It was a very major thing, and McDougall was really the top guy, and so it was a really good opportunity for me to kind of get into the higher echelons of legal academics, and I'd always had the idea of going into law teaching. I'm at a law school, and this was obviously very, very helpful for me to.
So from that experience, where did you go?
Well, my first job was at the University of Toledo Law School, and I worked there just for 2 years. I didn't really care for Toledo as a place to live, although I always say it's a really good place to have lived because everything else after that appears terrific. But that's not really true. There were some good aspects of it for me, but I only stayed there for 2 years, and then I went to New York and had a couple of jobs. I worked for the American Stock Exchange for about a year doing securities law type issues, and I worked for a major insurance company they were just getting into the business of selling variable annuities and variable life insurance, and that got them into the whole securities world. So securities law kind of became my specialty at that point. And in fact, it's interesting, one of the projects I worked on with the insurance company was preparing to comply with the securities laws with respect to variable life insurance, which was an insurance product, but also, since it could fluctuate up or down depending on the market, was regulated by the SEC in various ways.
You make this sound interesting.
Well, no, actually, I gave that topic to Chuck Harvey. We mentioned him. He was a second-year law student at that time, and it's a very complicated, difficult topic to deal with, the securities law aspects of variable life insurance. And he mastered that, in pretty short order, and wrote, his law review, second-year law review piece on that. At the law school, the law review people were chosen, at least at that time, I don't know how it is now, by submitting pieces. You weren't chosen by ranking the class. I think
everyone wrote on.
Everyone wrote on, although some might have gotten on by grades, like the top 4, the top 8 or something. But he wrote his paper on this topic that I gave him, and did a really good job, and that propelled him to be the law review editor-in-chief.
Wow. So who lured you to Maine law?
Well, I was working in New York, as I said, after the Toledo situation, and my wife and I bought a little house in southern Vermont, and in Dorset, Vermont, a very nice little community. And then I thought I wanted to get back into law teaching, so I just picked some law schools that were in the area, like Albany and Connecticut and Maine. I think I wrote to those 3 schools. And Connecticut has become a really good law school, but at that time they were having a lot of problems and they couldn't get their act together, so they never invited me. I had an interview with Albany, and I didn't, I don't think it was a place for me. And in fact, there was a student there who was a son of friends of my mother's, and he knew I was interviewing there. And as I was walking out after the interview, he kind of buttonholed me in the corridor and said, "Don't come here." Oh. It's really
wrong time.
It's not a good place, and you shouldn't come here. And then Maine was just the first offer I got. I came up for interviews, and they made me an offer, and I accepted it.
So this was at the time Ed Godfrey was dean.
Yes.
And he had built the school from the early 60s, and this is early 70s as you are arriving.
Like
it's been about
72,
a decade. And you started in the building on High Street?
Well, for about a month. And then we just moved over to the what was the round building.
So I've been very vocal about my experience in the round building, which had been not maintained over the course of decades, and it was a terrible building by the time I was there in law school administration. What was it like to move into it as a new building?
Well, I don't know. I was never a big building person. I mean, where we were it's important was who we were and what we were doing, and I wasn't really. Didn't much matter to you where you were doing it. When Peter Rogoff was dean, there was a huge movement for a new building, and that just seemed. I thought we ought to be focusing on what we do there and the program and the students, and I thought there was as much ado about something that wasn't ultimately that important. But I guess in recruiting students and in the law school world, it is important.
It is. So. In recruiting, having a bad building is really
well, my office was particularly bad because there were leaks coming down and
already.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. It wasn't really then. It's later. My heater didn't work too well, and they could never really get it right, and so I had to bring my own heater in and stuff like that. But again, I never really focused on that. I mean, I was focused on what I was doing there and not where I was.
So let's go back to you are beginning as a faculty member at the University of Maine School of Law.
Yeah.
What was your specialty at the time? International law?
No, not at all. That was my ultimate interest, but I had, I don't know, I guess I wanted to get a teaching job, and for some reason, I don't quite know why, I ended up I didn't quite finish the program, but I took a bunch of courses at NYU in their tax program. So, but corporate tax, corporate finance, securities law, that was sort of my specialty at that time. That's what I did for the first 8 or 10 years at the law school.
Your favorite area of law has been international law,
Right.
conflict of laws, but you began as a tax law teacher.
Well, yes, and a lot of that was strategic in order to get a job teaching in a law school. You know, I just, but in hindsight, I mean, I think, and I realized it at the time, I think tax law, securities law, corporate law, and all of that was really incredibly important for me in terms of teaching methodology and, you know, hardcore legal analysis, because the things I really was interested in, like constitutional law, international law, comparative law to some extent, it's all kind of what do you think, and it's more sort of policy-oriented stuff, whereas, you know, securities law, tax law specifically, you know, you've got tons of statutes and regulations, they're all very complicated, and rules and procedures and all of that, and you have to kind of work through that as a...
It's a different kind of rigor.
Well, I don't think constitutional law or international is that rigorous. It's kind of more policy oriented, and in fact, you know, I've done a lot with European law and French law, and it's only recently that the French even consider something like constitutional law like hardcore law. It's not respected. It's in terms of, you know, what a legal academic should be, and it was the private law people, contracts, torts, you know, they have civil codes of law, and it's all very rigorous analysis based on the provisions of those codes, whereas you know, constitutional law or international, it's all sort of, you know, what the policy is. So it's not really hardcore law.
So let's talk about the French law program for a moment. Are you fluent in French?
In the present, I'm sort of losing it, but I was. And I taught in France for about 20 years. I would teach 1 month every year in France. I did an 18-hour course.
And you were teaching in French?
Oh, yeah.
So that requires a level of fluency beyond conversational French. You've got to be able to understand all of the legal concepts that you are teaching in.
I wrote out my lectures. In France, there's less classroom interaction, and it's more, as the French say, unilateral. You know, the professor puts it out there, and the course is not the course that you're trying to help the students learn, but what the professor says is the course. It's a very...
Did you enjoy the unilateral presentation as much as you did the Socratic method here?
Well, my classes tended to be like small, like 20, 30 students, and so I developed a lot of you know, interaction in the class. And in fact, a lot of those students that I had you know, in France over the years, you know, I've become lifelong personal friends. And interestingly, one of them who was involved in my French law program from the French side is now a vice president of the Sorbonne. And the Sorbonne has about 12 vice presidents, and he's like number 2 in the hierarchy for financial and legal affairs. And our law school still has a strong relationship with him and other people like that over there.
So over time, your teaching assignments morphed from tax to much more international law.
Well, right. Ed Godfrey did conflicts for a while, and there was one time where he, I think, had a hernia operation and was in the hospital, and I took over the course for about half a semester, and then subsequently I started to teach that. But I began to teach international law regularly, you know, every year, and I developed a course in European law, European community law, which I taught, you know, often, and comparative law, where I did, you know, usually French and German constitutional law, or maybe private law sometimes. So the last 20 years or so, it was mainly international law, comparative law, conflict of laws, and then European law, and then I've taught like jurisprudence, and you know, I developed a course in law and literature. See, I think about the skills, you know, that a lawyer should have in terms of trying to figure things out in terms of a particular case. And I think history is very important. You know, what happened before. I mean, that's what a case is. You know, you've got to know what happened before. There's also comparative. how different states or different legal systems would treat similar situations in terms of coming up with ideas to how you might argue to a court to do this rather than that. Philosophical, jurisprudential, what law is, where does it come from? Do courts make it up? Is it statutory? I mean, it's a relationship between statutes and the common law, sort of judge-made law. And then also, I think very, very important, and I think as I observe how things work, more important is what I call the affective element, how people feel about things, how you convince a judge or jury to feel about something by crafting a narrative and how you put it together in terms of the case and so forth. So the courses I taught, these 4 or 5 sort of intellectual approaches to thinking about law, like the comparative, the historical, the philosophical, the affective, and so forth. And I taught courses in all those areas. And I developed a course in what's called Law and Literature, where we read classics that dealt with problems that not necessarily involve cases or whatever, but involve the kinds of things that are important for how people perceive. And
so I'm gonna come back to this for a minute and just do a quick sidestep here. Your son Ben, who's an extraordinary trial attorney, weaves many of those approaches of law into a real excellence in working with fact finders, particularly with juries, and has done some amazing work. So you have 3 sons, am I right?
Right.
Did Ben get this from you? Did you spend a lot of time at the dinner table talking about?
My wife will tell you how the dinner table every night was an argument, and about all sorts of things. But I also want to say that over the last 20 years since he's come to Maine and started practicing, trial work, I've learned an incredible amount from him, just in terms of describing his cases and how he approaches them, and it's affected my teaching tremendously. See, I don't think a law professor should teach law. I think a law professor should teach lawyering. Law is a bunch of rules and stuff and regulations, but lawyering is how you achieve a result, and you want to, here's the problem and here's the result that you want, and how you get to that result. Ben once said to me, he said, I couldn't really start practicing law till I forgot 90% of what I learned in law school. And I figured out
that's alarming to a dean of a law school.
And what he meant was that it's all about the facts. And he's amazing in learning. I mean, he cross-examines expert in, say, medical malpractice, and he figures out things or theories, and he criticizes the rules like the medical associations have for how you should do a case. And he was just describing one of those things recently. He does a podcast, and he sort of figures out that the medical approach to dealing with this thing is not the right approach, that it should be this rather than that. And he's done the same thing with other cross-examining or deposing expert witnesses from top universities and places, and he's able to, so I think he's really right. It's the facts that count. And I remember once I talked to Judge Wernick way back, and he was saying up until sometime in the mid-'70s, arguments in the law court, even on appeal, were principally arguments or discussions of the facts, that the court wanted to understand the facts better. Maybe now it's more focused on the legal analysis, but I think the facts are very, very, very important, and the facts are history and comparative and philosophical, like I'm saying, and also the way people feel about things, and that's sort of why I developed this law and literature class.
So if the facts are very important, and how people feel about those facts are incredibly important, do you think the United States is in a transition to a different approach to law than it has taken for the last, say, 50 years?
Well, I don't know. That's a That's a book length type question. I don't know.
You're the expert. That's why I'm
well,
asking.
things are certainly changing. I mean, I'm a huge fan of de Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, and he talks about habits of the heart, the way people think and feel, which is more important for how politics works, and Democracy in America is his book, and he discusses that. And I think the habits of the heart of Americans have changed. The culture's become very crass and crude, and you look on the internet, everybody's criticizing everybody else about everything, and people are responding, and there's just no sort of magnanimity anymore in interpersonal relations, and especially when interpersonal relations are done remotely by phone or text. Now, I'm told now even people don't talk on the phone. You've got to text people. And I sort of came to this insight years ago when I see how people drive. And people drive and someone cuts them off, and then the person in the other car will give them the finger, but they would never do that if they were face to face. It's this sort of impersonal. We think we have so much communication, but it's impersonal communication, and I think that has an effect.
So the digital distance that we are all experiencing now is going to have an effect in how the law is used going forward.
Well, I think how people just interrelate and laws a way of kind of, the structuring and deciding how interrelations are to be dealt with.
So let me take you backwards to really, I think, a very different time. And I'm going to use a name, Jimmy Carter, and ask you how you became involved in his campaign.
I had an opportunity to meet with Jimmy Carter for about an hour in the Portland Jetport. There was a conference room there, and so we talked for an hour, and I was very impressed by him in a whole lot of respects. His intelligence, the way he was. I think we all kind of have a sense of what he was, but I was very, very impressed by him. And I also thought that in order to win the election, California was a Republican state at that time, and the whole electoral map looked different. And in order to win an election, and I think that's still maybe true to some extent now, as Bill Clinton showed, you've got to win some southern states. And so you have to have someone, hopefully from the South or someone acceptable to the South. And Jimmy Carter was that, he fit that mold, whereas Morris Udall or some of these other people really didn't. So I was I'm very practical in the sense that you want to win. The elections are to be won. And it's not necessarily the person with the best policies, but if your team is headed by someone that can win the election, that's really what you want, even though that person might not be the ideal person in terms of what your policies are, say liberal or conservative. I think Carter had the best electoral profile, and so after meeting him with an hour or so, I was convinced and just got involved with the campaign and set up some.
Just got involved. What did that mean for you? What were you actually doing?
Well, I was contacting people who were going to be important for the caucuses, either political leaders or people that were going to go to the caucuses, and just convince them to be.
So you were on the phone.
Well, I was on the phone, but I think the big event that allowed Carter to be successful in the Maine caucuses was I organized a day where Carter flew into Bangor, had an event in Bangor, and then we just came down the Maine Turnpike in Waterville, in Lewiston, in Portland. We took a side step down to Biddeford, but all the major population centers in the state. And he had about an hour event in each of those places. And we got people, or I got people to attend and publicize those things. And Ken Curtis was a supporter. So, and Ken addressed the Portland event, and I think that was what was successful in having Carter kind of be successful in the caucuses.
So with with all those skills in a national political campaign, why didn't you continue in that field?
Well, let me say one other thing. I realized that a large part of New Hampshire's TV market comes out of Maine, the Portland TV stations. And New Hampshire at that time, this is historical, but New Hampshire at that time, their primary was the key to winning a nomination. And so we put a lot of effort into Maine for that reason. That it was basically not so much Maine, but the effect it was going to have on New Hampshire. The top people, Hamilton, Jordan, Jody Powell, the leaders of the Carter effort, who eventually got high positions in government, they came to Maine, and we kind of organized this whole thing with the object of winning, particularly Portland, which was the first caucus right before the New Hampshire primary to influence New Hampshire.
So just listening to that, you had an intuitive understanding of what had to happen where and when in order to affect national politics.
Yeah.
Why haven't you stayed in it?
I don't know. I just had I'm not an ambitious person. I mean, I like what I do. I like teaching. I like sort of the academic life, and I wasn't ambitious trying to get someplace higher.
And you had an opportunity.
Well, I don't know.
When Carter won.
Yes, I never really pursued that, actually. And I didn't say I wanted to do the judicial nominating commissions. They just appointed me to that. That
was an opportunity in itself. But did you ever think about saying to the person who had won the presidency, I'd like to be Secretary of State?
Well, I don't think I would have been appointed, but no, I never really. I mean, if I had aspirations, it would have been for, because I was in business law at that time, like the SEC or something, or something like that. But I never really wanted that. I just like what I did, and I like to be here. And
you just happened to be very good at a national presidential campaign.
Well, yeah, I think I was, and I don't know. I'm sort of. After the Carter campaign, I was involved in politics for a little while. There was a gubernatorial campaign. I was the chairman of. The person didn't emerge, but pretty much I left that to my son. My son Ben ended up working for Tom Allen when Tom was first elected to Congress, and he really ran his campaign when Tom won the Democratic primary against a woman who everyone thought was going to win the election. So Ben has kind of taken over that role, and then of course Ben is married to a woman who was Sarah Gideon, who was the candidate for the Democrats. So, but I'm sort of on the sidelines, but I'm very interested in this, in politics, and I've been talking to one of the candidates for governor in this Democratic primary and kind of giving him my unsolicited advice, and I've talked with him from time to time. I don't know if he takes any of that advice, but he seems receptive to it.
I hear it was actually solicited advice, but we'll move past that. Yeah. People are still seeking out your advice.
Well, I suppose so, but
very modest about the skills that you demonstrated, but let's get back to it. In the end, what you've enjoyed the most is teaching.
Well,
and
right,
writing?
and teaching and writing, and I just really like this law school. I had opportunities to leave the school. I was here for about 4 or 5 years, and I had an offer from a law school that one would consider a step up, but also a law school that had a reputation of supporting faculty writing and all that. And let's face it, in the law school world, teaching is kind of low down on the hierarchy, and maybe isn't even on the hierarchy. That it's writing and being on TV or something, and but it's writing and publication that's the key thing. And I really just liked the whole teaching experience, and I liked our school specifically. And one of the reasons I really liked our school, or like our school, is because of its small size. I think that's really our biggest asset is the small size. And there was a movement a number of years ago under a predecessor dean here to kind of perhaps increase the size of the school. And I thought that would be terribly misguided. And I liked it because it's small. You could relate to the students. It was better for the students to be in a small situation. And I think also for faculty, because the faculty members have to be involved in all aspects of the program. You can't just teach your courses and go home. You have to, at least when I came, we had a faculty admissions committee. We were involved in admissions. We were involved in placement. We were involved in curriculum. We were involved really in everything. So you've got a kind of a holistic view of the whole law teaching enterprise.
To be clear, I have a bias here, which is I agree with you completely that the size of Maine law is just about perfect right now.
But one thing I would say is I don't think we've really capitalized on that as well as we could. I don't know exactly what that means, what we should be doing in terms of size or mentoring, or I don't quite know, or programs, but I don't think we've really done that. I know our first year class, at least I think that's changed now, and now it's been sectioned or something, but it was just everybody in one room. I mean, that's probably the way you experienced it.
I did. My class was about 90 students.
Right.
And the class right now, the class size is about 100, with some suggestion that because the applications have increased so substantially, we should be enlarging it, and we have pressed back against that to try to keep the community.
Well, I'll tell you something. I look at these rankings, and of course, the rankings are bad for one reason, but they are very important in terms of where students decide to go to law school, and if you look at the rankings of the top law schools, say the top 6 or 8 law schools. Yale is always ranked number 1. Why is that?
Why is that?
I'll tell you why. It's no better than Harvard or Columbia, which were always traditionally 2 and 3. The reason is because Yale is small. Yale has, when I went there, it was like 175 students. Harvard was over 600, and Columbia was close to 400. And now Stanford and Chicago have moved up, and Stanford sometimes is like number 2 or even tied with Yale. And Stanford is a small law school, by the Harvard-Columbia standards. And Chicago is also a small law school. So I think, the best students want to go to the most competitive law schools. It's sort of a thing, And,
of course.
And if you're accepting 60 or 75% of the applications, that becomes less attractive than if they're accepting 20 or 30% or 5% or whatever. So that's my theory for why Yale and now Stanford and Chicago have moved up. And I thought we always benefited from that.
Yes.
We always benefited from that as being small, and we could, maybe sounds callous or anything, but we could reject a lot of people. But we tried to get the better people, and they would be more likely to come if it were a more competitive school.
And there was a period of time, we don't need to get into the details here, where Maine law was really struggling financially and had to accept a lot of students and heavily discount tuition, which was also an issue. But you are one of the professors who has seen and worked with every dean of this incarnation of Maine law. And having seen all of the deans through these last many years, what's your advice to a current dean?
Well, I don't know. I maybe I shouldn't say this because it sounds patronizing, but I think you're doing a wonderful job, and my advice is...
You can say that. That's all right.
And my advice would be a dean should replicate the way you've been doing the job. I don't want to criticize anybody specifically.
What didn't work and what did work?
Well, I think
that would be
one
helpful.
thing that works is being there, representing the law school, caring about what's going on at the school, being a presence at events and not leaving halfway through. I think those things are very significant. But I think we've been very, very fortunate in our deans, and of course Ed Godfrey at the beginning.
Yes.
You know, when I first came to the law school in the 70s, if I met people like at the professors convention and all that, they would know about Ed Godfrey, and this was, and he put the school on the map, really.
He did. He did some almost magic.
And in terms
bring the school together.
In terms of rankings, when he was the dean and for a number of years after, we were ranked in the top half of law schools, like in the 80s, 70 or 80 out of the 180 or 200 law schools. Mm-hmm. And now we're back down into the 80s again. So not to give all that much credence to it, but it is kind of one public face the law school has to the world. And I think having higher rankings is better than lower rankings.
Well, I would agree with you on that in almost every aspect.
Yeah.
Having higher, which is actually lower rankings,
right, yeah.
Attracts more students.
Yeah.
We're very fortunate that we have almost half of the students incoming here are from out of state and tend to stay in Maine, which is a wonderful thing across the board. So talk to me about the relationship between deans and faculty. One of my concerns is that part of the reason Maine law dropped in the rankings so precipitously was that a lot of faculty left, just could not stay because of the fiscal issues and the inability to support travel and conferences and being part of the American scene of faculty. How important is that?
Well, I don't know. I think if I look around at the professors who have really built the school, I think of people like Dave Gregory and Mel Czar and David Clucci and Colleen Curry and
Jenny, who we
Tom
just
Ward and Jenny. But I think these are people that want to be here. I know this sounds very parochial or provincial, but I think if someone has a strong attraction and wants to be here, and that's a large part of why I stayed, because I had offers to go, a couple of offers, after I'd been here for a short time, and one of the principal reasons I didn't go was because I just liked the community, and my wife liked the community. My kids were doing well. I didn't want to uproot people, and I think that's important. So I think having a commitment to the state, and I think now a lot of the people we're hiring, not that they're not good people, they're very good people, but they're really not. They're just they go to law school or in practice. This is their first teaching job or something like that, but they're not really committed to being in the place. They're what I might call careerists, and that has maybe a bad connotation, but it's still, they want to write a few articles and get tenure, and then they go somewhere else. I think of some of the better people we've had who've left.
It is a step. It is a career path in being faculty that is not necessarily conducive to building the community and the roots, and that's something we all look at. Let me ask you to think about when you were leaving law school, and tell me what's your best advice to our students who are graduating and going out into the world of law. What should they know from all of your years of experience?
Well, I don't know. I haven't taken a traditional path. I mean, I was asked to stay on at the law school as a researcher for a couple of years, and then I went into teaching for a while and then got into practice after that, and then back into teaching. So I guess figure out sort of what they would like to do, like public sector stuff, or tax law, and then you get an LLM, or trial work, and you just try to get a job with a law firm. I don't. It's hard for me to put myself into that position.
Let me sort of wind this back. You know that there is a professorship being set up in your name. Yeah. And what this has taught me just in the last 6 months is how much you affected people's lives through the years. So our alumni have all gathered together. I'm hearing from people from all through the years that you taught here, how much you helped them understand law as they were coming through. So you have you're very humble about this, but you have a lot to say to people who are about to practice.
I think the thing that's best for students in terms of relationship with faculty is the faculty person is there for them and the relationship is established over the course of time. And I think people respond very well when other people are simply interested in them and supportive of them. I made a point at the law school just to contrast me with another faculty member. There's a faculty member that was here for a while. She's a very, very good faculty member. She ended up leaving and now is at a top law school. But there was a story that circulated around where a student knocked on her door to see her, and she responded by saying, "Oh, I can't talk now, I'm busy writing." And then the door was closed and the student left. And I think that story circulated around the law school among the students as a very negative sort of thing. And my way of doing things was I always left my door open. I never shut it. I mean, I just unless someone was in there and we were talking, but I always left it open. And I think, and I always was a little, I suppose, apologetic about this. The next door office was David Clucci's office, and I was wondering if things that were going on in my office, a phone conversation or when I was talking to a student, disturbed him because I always left my door open. But I just wanted to leave it open so students could just come in at any time. And if I was writing or something, which I did a lot of, I just put it aside.
That is great advice to faculty.
So I think the thing is you've got to care about the students as the principal focus of your job. And the writing I do is not so much because I want to be famous and do all of that. I mean, it's because, number one, a law professor should do it just because that's part of the job, and also it makes you a much better teacher because you get much more deeply into things and you figure out how to do analysis and that's what you're trying to ultimately teach. And so I think it's putting the students first and the other aspects of the job second, because the students are the principal aspect of the job.
I want to say thank you for all of this time. This has really been a great honor to be able to interview you. Let me ask you, is there something that I didn't ask you that you wish that I had?
One of the things I'm most proud of and it engaged me the most was this French program over the years. And I also had, on a lesser level, relationships with an Italian law school.
Do you speak Italian?
Well, I like to say I learned it fast and I've forgotten it fast. But I've written 50-page articles. In fact, one of the best experiences I ever had was the law school I went to in Italy was University of Turin, which is really one of the top law schools in Italy. And they would invite me back every year and I'd give lectures and talk to people. But I was asked to give a lecture about the American election when Obama was elected in 2008. And it was like a week after the election. So I had to write the thing, I had my Italian teacher kind of go over it to make sure it was okay. And so I wrote this thing in Italian, and I used the 538 website to kind of figure out so I could write the article about what was going to happen before it happened, and that Nate Silver was just really right about how that election was going to turn out. So my article really substantively didn't really need much change, but that was one of the most, I guess, moving experiences in my life when I wrote this article, which it was to be the basis of a talk which I gave at the University of Turin. It was like a week after the election when Obama was elected, and there were like 300 people there. Wow. And I did it all in Italian, and I was able to, but the Italian has kind of declined. I mean, I have ambition to get it back, but it's I've never really, I don't have the discipline.
Did you, at this lecture where there were 300 people and there had just been a fairly extraordinary American election, was there a give and take? Were there questions
Yes.
that followed?
No, I could operate it. It was, like I said, I learned it fast and I've forgotten it fast, but I was pretty good at it. And I've written like 3-4 long law review articles, 35 pages or more in Italian.
In Italian?
Yeah.
That's amazing, Marty.
I mean, I'm sort of a crossword puzzle doer. I've been doing crossword puzzles since junior high school. The New York Times puzzle, I used to do it every day. And I think writing in a foreign language is like doing a puzzle. It's like doing you've got to piece things together and all of that. Although now I'm sort of amazed at how these translation apps work. I had a student, maybe 15, 20 years ago at the law school who wanted to write a paper on some topic. I guess it was a European law topic, but he wanted to write it in German because he had studied German and knew German. And I said, yes, I know German. I'd studied that in college too, and he could do that. And so he did that. But
wait, you supervised a student writing an article in German,
right.
And you also spoke German. How many languages
I don't really speak,
Marty?
Well, the thing is, my grandmother lived with us when I was growing up, and my mother and my grandmother spoke German all the time. So it was kind of in the air where I lived. And one of the best courses I've ever had in college was at Cornell. My last year, I took it was called an introductory German course, but the course meant 8 hours per week. There were 3 hours of grammar in a small group, 3 hours with a native speaker, and 2 hours where people, the whole class was gotten together. They called it lecture, where we went over books. So it was 8 hours a week.
Wow.
It was like
That's
a double
real immersion.
It was a double course, and I just learned huge amounts in that course. Plus, and I've forgotten a lot of that, but
that's amazing. Are there any other languages you want to tell us about now that you speak?
Well, not really.
Were you involved with the Russian program at all?
No, not at all. That was Kluchi's and Judy Potter to some extent. Yeah.
Yes. So only English, French, Italian, German.
English,
That's
French, Italian. Yeah, I guess. But,
fairly extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, I've got I've got a son. You asked me about my first son, but my third son has lived in Europe for about 20 years, in Berlin for 10 years, and now he lives in Prague. And he's got 2 children, and his daughter, who's now 16 or 17, she grew up in Germany and went to a German preschool, so she speaks German. My son speaks English to her because he never really learned Czech that well. And his wife speaks Czech, she's Czech. And then she just finished a year in Spain where she, with Spanish.
Spanish immersion as well.
And she went to, she goes to a Jewish school in Prague, and they teach Hebrew as a modern language. And I tell her
family gift.
Well, I tell
languages.
her she's got to learn French. That's the thing. Yeah. And I told my son he had to learn, my third son, that he had to learn French. He was.
How's that going?
Well, he spent a summer there, but never really took up. He's very good in German. He translated a couple of Kafka, a Kafka novel called The Castle, from German to English. These translations have been published.
Wow.
And he's a world-class Kafka expert, and he's got a blog on he writes pieces about Kafka all the time, and you can almost see Kafka's house from where he lives in Prague, because I don't know if you know Prague at all, but he lives across the river from where the so-called castle is up there,
yes.
And you can almost see it from his house, and Kafka lived right around there.
So all of this talent has been passed down to the next generation and a generation beyond.
Well, my son, the
Very
lawyer,
impressive.
the lawyer's son, and then my history son, the third one, and he teaches. I call him a freelance intellectual because he teaches. He teaches for a school in Prague, but he's been teaching online for USM and SMCC and
Wow.
and a bunch of other things, and he's written like 3 or 4 novels. But my second son is a scientist. He has a PhD in immunology and works
Wow.
for Dana-Farber
Good.
in Boston.
We need this.
He's worked for a number of biotech companies, and then he did lab work, and then now he's kind of in a sort of more of a I don't know, business side. Dana-Farber is a nonprofit. They do a lot of research, but they can't monetize their research, so they want to establish with venture capital, corporations, which they will have
All of the
ownership.
tech transfer necessary.
And so he's involved with getting the money and trying to set up these companies that they can transfer their whatever it is, their procedures, their patented stuff to
That's
them.
a fairly extraordinary legacy.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting for me because one of them is a lawyer, but my son Ben is also, I don't know if you know, but he's a very business-oriented lawyer in terms of.
Oh, we watched this.
in
Yes,
terms-
absolutely.
He started his own law firm. He's built it up, and now he's doing consulting about law firm building development. I don't know if
Right.
so he's a sort of a lawyer / businessman. My third son is a sort of an intellectual who wouldn't
Freelance intellectual.
freelance. That's what
I
I
like
call
that.
him. Who wouldn't wouldn't go to law school if you paid him, and my middle son is a scientist, so it connects me to like 3 different worlds.
Got it covered.
Yeah, and it's very interesting.
Thank you so much for giving me this time today. This has just
Okay.
absolutely been wonderful. We will wrap it up with our gratitude toward you. Thank you for allowing us to build this professorship, which will
Well-
help us keep all of the new faculty here in Maine.
Okay,
Thank you
well,
very
and I'd
much.
like to thank you. I just think you've done a great job, and you've been very kind to me over the years.
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you again.